Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Abundant Wednesdays. My business partner, Nina McNamara, and myself are here today to talk to you and to introduce you to one of our good friends, Tom Thurmeier. Here is from Small Business Legal Center. He's one of our attorneys that we work with, and he's here to talk today about asset protection and why, as real estate investors, we need this. Now, some of you are experienced, you already have an asset structure, a corporate structure. Some of you are just getting started. So Tom is a wealth of information. So we're going to, have some good information here today from Tom. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nina.
Thanks, Shelley. Nice to see everyone. And thank you so much for being here, Tom. It is always a pleasure to see you. I have known Tom for quite some time because I had the privilege of having Tom as my lawyer, as my corporate lawyer. And Tom's really great because on the odd occasion, I've had to call Tom up and say, I need some advice. And then there's Tom. So he's a fabulous, fabulous resource to have. So when I first met you, you were teaching asset protection. And so can we talk a little bit about how us as investors, we need to protect our assets, and a little bit about the corporate structure that allows us to do that so we can keep ourselves safe?
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question, and it's great to be here, you guys. Thanks so much for having me. I'm amazed we've known each other for quite some time, so it's really great to see you both being active. That's a great question, Nina. Like, a lot of people often ask, hey, lawyer guy, what is this asset protection stuff? I read a book or I saw the concept, and what do I need it? What should I do it? These kinds of things. And I mean, I think the first question people ask, well, why bother? Why do we care about this sort of stuff? And I think that the basic answer to that is we care because everybody else cares. A court of law, a tax auditor, you can sort of develop that into saying, like, even interested parties, litigation, litigants, whether or not they bring a claim, creditors, lenders, for how they'll structure a commercial or residential deal. They'll sort of care as to who's doing what now. And so asset protection kind of speaks to what person, what entity, what taxpayer is doing this transaction. And so those various parties will care, like a bank or a lender in placing financing. They'll want to know what's going on. So why do we bother? Well, we bother because everybody else cares. How a court of law, how a tax auditor, how a lender will look at us depends on how we've set things up. I think the other sort of big question for folks is, what is asset protection? Like, this is where you break out the jokes and you say, I want to cover my assets, things like that. But it really is, I think, more than that for a lot of lawyers and estate planners, tax planners, accountants and things. It can be a practice, a career could be spent on this topic. So it's potentially complicated depending on the circumstances, depending on the person. And everybody is completely different, depending on who we're dealing with and what they're doing. So asset protection, from one point, sort of looks like, well, how to structure things to sort of protect my assets, how to grow wealth. I want to acquire real estate or interest in property or money or gold bars or, Bitcoin or whatever you're into acquiring. And then I want to try, sort of grow that and, I guess, maximize my use and enjoyment of that. Is maybe a concept to use. But the other side of asset protection then is sort of more of liability, and we want to try and minimize our risk and our liability, maybe more from a risk management perspective, right? So there's kind of those two elements that most, I think, planners would look at from an asset protection standpoint. So well, protect yourself from what then? People say, like falling rocks from the sky, or what should I be worried about? I mean, most often it's sort of uncertainty, the best laid plans of mice and men, as it were. Uncertainties can be stuff like lawsuits, legal claims, litigation, but also things like relationships, marriages and divorce and deaths, and never mind political and environmental uncertainties. And I think we've got a few of those going on these days. you know, how about stuff like just changing tax laws? You know, they're always evolving and changing. And so not only as a person, as we evolve and get older and change as an investor, our needs may change. Our goals, our priorities, our risk tolerance may change, but also, you know, the fish in the fishbowl, our environment changes. All these other things can go. So an asset protection and risk management plan is trying to look at some of that stuff with a view to the future. But, you know, no one can foresee the future. It's foolish to think otherwise. You know, we just do our best, and that's kind of the idea. So overall asset protection for real estate investors, I think a lot of time is about trying to build a portfolio of properties, and again, maximize the use and enjoyment, maybe maximize the income and expense or tax planning elements to minimize taxes, but also estate planning and succession planning to try and minimize estate taxes and things like that. These are sort of the overall goals. But, you know, we always have to remember a few guiding principles with a lot of this material is time is your friend, you know, for example. So if you're moving stuff on the eve of bankruptcy, you know, that's a problem, right? You could have interested parties, creditors, or a court that would dispute that transaction, would dispute that structure. A court might even have a power to overturn that transaction. Maybe it's something called a fraudulent preference, where you're creating a structure just to defeat a creditor, you know, with your sort of sole and primary intention. Again, a court has very broad discretion to undo that. So how many times have you heard of someone saying, oh, I don't own those assets, you know, I sold them to my related company, you know, the night before my bankruptcy? Well, again, that's not likely going to help you much. So time is your friend. Structuring, planning, thinking in advance is better. Time is your friend in the sense of, you know, acquiring assets and then moving them around. That can be a real problem. And there's people like myself that deal with that regularly. And, you know, frankly, their whole career is based on it. So accountants, estate planners, you know, lawyers like myself that are moving either shares of companies or real estate corporations back and forth between parties, creating wills and estates, you know, for people. This part of the planning becomes key because, you know, moving stuff around costs money and has tax consequences, right? It's a big deal. So if you start buying properties in your own name and then you want to transfer to your real estate co later, you're going to be dealing with land titles and legal costs of transfer, potential mortgage payout for any financing, capital gains, you know, all of these kinds of things. And maybe at that time, for that property, for that person, that's not a big deal. They're going to redo the financing anyway. The mortgage is up. There's no payout penalty. It's open. There's no gain at this particular time. Or maybe in the next example, for that guy, for that property at that time, it is a big deal. There is a capital gain. There is a mortgage payout penalty. There is transfer tax because, hey, he's in Ontario. So, you know, land titles is like $8,000, not $300, you know, that kind of stuff, right? So asset protection, a lot is trying to structure how we hold those assets to maximize use and enjoyment, protect ourselves from uncertainty, but we always be mindful of, like, time is our friend, transaction costs. We want to not be wasteful there. Obviously, insurance is still important to sort of minimize and even defer or spread risk. We can't forget about insurance. It's usually required if you want to place a mortgage on real estate, for example. But, you know, these sorts of things are what people care about. So I think for a lot of folks then it's sort of become, well, okay, well, what are our choices? You know, should I incorporate? That's almost always the first thing that comes very early in a conversation is, you know, I read a book or my friend has a company and I want to create one of those. I want to bulletproof myself. And it isn't quite simple, but, you know, the choices from an asset protection standpoint is you could do sort of what we would call in law, you know, a sole proprietor, sort of like Tom the guy doing stuff. So no separate taxpayer, no separate person, even if I'm using a trade name. So, you know, Happy Properties, just a trade name, I can register it, you know, it's still just me. So I'm on title to the land, I'm on the mortgage, those two things have to match. any income from the property is going to me and my tax return. Right now, not later, just me, not my wife, right? I'm the only registered owner. Any lawsuits from problems with tenants or Occupiers Liability Act or the state of the land is going to me. So there's kind of a risk there. There's not an ability to defer income or split it. Any liabilities coming to me, it could be good, it could be bad, but that's sort of the element of a sole proprietor is just me doing things. So people do that because it's easy. They can just go off and get a business card and start doing deals. But I'm sure you ladies have found over your careers of many years now is you'll meet an investor starting to do some deals, starting to do some transactions, and they bought some properties, and so they've got one where just the husband has a title or two, and maybe the wife has a number of titles in her name, and they've got a couple together, and now they're sort of building several properties, and they want to look at, geez, I want to look at a corporate structure. We're back to that. Moving things around costs money and has tax consequences. So that conversation comes up all the time. And for those sometimes it comes up later, quite an expense to change things. So sole proprietor is easy. People just do it in their own names. That's fine. Another structure that sometimes people use is partnerships, which is a bit more of a legal relationship, kind of a risky thing, but it has joint and several liabilities. So if a couple investors just get together and start doing deals, they might find that it's been seen as a legal partnership, which you can have legal responsibilities and joint and several liabilities. So we want to be careful there. So the default then, the incorporation often is chosen because it's not those prior things. The corporation, it is a separate person. It is a separate taxpayer, and that's the whole point. You have it, right? So when you have a corporation, then usually you're trying to avoid the ownership by too many people. You're trying to not pool assets together. Have a limited number of properties per corporate structure, and for liability, for tax, for municipal bylaw purposes, or environmental laws, or ownership, or financing. For all these reasons, you're trying to isolate that property. And so usually we have a discussion with an investor like, so what property are you looking at? Are you married? Are you single? Are you young? Are you old? Are you divorced? Are you buying in this province or that province? Or where do you live? Do you have multiple business activities or other sources of income? Do you hope to hold the property for a significant time? Is it a commercial property? What's the value of the property? Is it, rental? Will you live there? All of these variables will speak to what we might suggest for somebody as to, structure. Always in the view of moving things later costs money and has tax consequences. So we always like to try and plan, right? So
I remember, Tom, when I was first working with you, Tom, and I still remember this because we were discussing, because it is a bit of a cost to start it up, and you're like, oh, as a new investor, can I do this? Should I do this? And you said it very nicely to me. You're like, Nina, you need to lay a decent foundation first before you build your house. So laying the foundation of your corporation first and then building on it makes it for a more sturdy construction later on. And I still remember that from 13 years ago, that this was the advice that you gave me, and it sticks to me. And as you're talking today, I'm thinking, yes, this is it. Lay the foundation, everyone. Get the foundation laid first, and then you can build an amazing house after.
Exactly.
Oh,
Exactly.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. And I think that is an overriding message that I, as a lawyer, will often tell people. I'll get the initial call. And hi, lawyer, I've got some stuff and I want to talk about doing this or doing that or moving things around. And so we're instantly into that conversation. I really like that analogy, and I use it a lot for people, especially if you're talking about various structures that are used by a lot of real estate investing groups. And there's lots of them, but they look at different names, but sort of a hold co, parent co, that owns maybe a real estate co and maybe a property management co underneath it. So, the three-tier, the triangle of companies, for example. Even just a parent co and a real estate co, underneath it, a wholly owned subsidiary is another very common example. And that really speaks to that question you raised, Nina, about like, should I put in a hold co? Do I have to start with a hold co? Can I put it in later? Kind of question.
Right.
And of course, you can put in that holdco later, but if you buy just one real estate co and buy one property in it, you have a separate person, a separate taxpayer, you have limited liability protection, you can set up co-ownership and things with others, you have all the sort of pluses of a corporation. But if you want to add a holdco later, it's like lifting the house to put the basement in, is usually the analogy. And so,
Yeah.
you know, if you want a house with a basement, I have a great idea. Dig the hole first.
Yeah.
Like, it's just as simple as that.
Yeah.
And it comes down to that, you know, over and over again for people I've seen over decades of dealing with people. And, you know, that's just, I guess, a natural process. So it's a great point you make, you know, for sure, to deal with that. And with respect to that, like creating a 3-tier or that type of structure, there are ways to phase it in. There are ways to build it over time. Most people choose to do it because they're often looking to build a bit more of a portfolio of several properties. Maybe they're going to get into doing some investment strategies, whether they call it the rent to owns or sandwich lease options, or, you know, these types of things. Or they're going to have joint ventures with other parties that they may want to have their structure holding the property, and then, you know, have an interest with a third party that they might sell off to them in the future. So the 3-tier or the start of that type of structure is often used for privacy, for control, financing, co-ownership, even divestment, succession, and sale of property can give you more choices down the road, right? So that's kind of the kind of thing. So
this is definitely a large topic, isn't it?
Yes. Oh my gosh.
And then in my mind, I'm also thinking, oh, Tom's talking about trust. He's talking about wills. I'm like, that's a whole nother conversation we need to have, because I think as investors, once we start getting this gears going, then we start thinking of legacy. We start thinking of passing things on. And that's a whole new conversation that we need to have about creating a trust for our family, what's going to happen to the property. So I can definitely see that we're going to be having you back, Tom, and exploring some more options.
Yes, and Tom has a partner.
Happy to do it.
Oh,
well, for sure. My partner Ted is a very smart guy, and absolutely, he and I can both speak about these things. And I think the takeaway I'd like, you know, to give people, we have a short time here today, but these structures, these issues are big. We could talk about them for hours, days, weeks, honestly. You know, there's a lot there. But the corporate structure, you know, understand a corporation, it is a separate person, it is a separate taxpayer apart from you, investor, and that's the whole point. So is it always the right way to do it? Well, you know, maybe not. Is it always a cheaper interest rate or less taxes? You know, maybe not. You know, it depends on a bunch of stuff. And the rules are complicated and ever changing. But, you know, people usually look to that corporation as, it's not me, it's that other entity that owns the land, and that comforts me. And I can have co-ownership with other people, whether it's family members or not. You know, it might be third party sort of strangers we're doing joint ventures with, for example. There's a lot of choices with those tools. Is a hammer good or bad? I don't know. Is it better than a screwdriver? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I know what I want when I want to drive a nail.
Exactly.
Right? You know, for the right tool for the right job, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I really recommend the structure conversation is a good one to have, often earlier in the day. And again, you know, I think you hit it on the head when you say, I remember when I started, you know, we were looking at these sort of ideas, these structures, and geez, there's a bit of an expense or commitment. Should I do this? Should I do that? What will the future bring? And of course, nobody knows the answer to that. So we have to sit back and just within reasonable realm of, am I just buying a house for my stepmother to live in, or do I hope to build a portfolio of 2 or 3 properties? Or do I really hope to get into maybe a bit of commercial real estate, even on the smaller scale, like a 4-plex, 6-plex, 8-plex, that might be sort of more commercial? You know, these questions, once we start thinking that way, they can give us answers as to what structure might be appropriate.
And I think that's the key point here too, Tom, is that when you're building that structure, it allows you to grow in the future. And because I'm always constantly, I mean, I started out with originally, before we met you, we started with 1 company, and then we expanded to 2 and then 3. And then I went to asset protection with Tom and went, oh my gosh, we kind of did some things the wrong way. So we it took some time, as you said, because of tax complications, to
Yeah.
move things around. But, you know, over the time, I've had over 20 companies through my investing career, and they all fit
Yeah.
within
Yeah.
that structure, you know, that we set up originally to start with. So you know, it's really important to get a good foundation that you can grow and build on from there going forward. And so,
For sure,
as we
Shelley.
said,
Yeah.
we
Yeah,
could
for
talk
sure.
for hours about this conversation, this particular topic, right? Tom, normally you'd had a 3-day course on asset protection, so we definitely like
Yes.
to have you back, or you and Ted, or Ted as well, to come back from
Sure.
your
Love to
group
do
to
it.
talk for sure. We appreciate your time
Yeah,
today. We've
love
known
to
each
do it.
other a long time. It's so good to see you
Thank
again,
you.
and thank you so much for coming and sharing with us.
Absolutely, you too. Thanks for having me. Well, I'm sure we'll see you again, and thanks for putting content out there. There's a lot of
Yes.
investors that want to get started, and they like to hear about actual people and their experiences. So good for you for doing that.
Okay,
Thank you,
great.
Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
You
Well, you
bet.
have a great day,
Take care.
and thank you everybody for joining us today who are watching the video. And there's, you know, more to come, so we'll be back again. Have an abundant week. Bye from Shelley.
Take care from Nina.
All right, thanks again,
Bye.
Tom. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
You too.